Hi, thanks for coming. Today we have Eyal Lara from the University of Toronto talking about proximity-based authentication for mobile devices. Thanks, Eyal.
All right, hi. So today I'm going to talk about a project whose aim is to make it easy and secure for people to interact with devices that just come upon them over the course of the day. Now, why would such a thing be interesting? Well, there are many possible applications of interest that could benefit from secure ad hoc composition of devices. To give you an example, you can imagine a person that checks into a hotel room and they would like to, for instance, extend the capabilities of their mobile phone by, for instance, pairing it with, let's say, a large screen or some input devices. You can imagine people running into each other and wanting to exchange information. Some applications are even simpler than that, having hands-free and plugging it, or rather pairing it with your phone. And other applications, such as actually using your devices as electronic wallets to pay for stuff. So underlying all these applications is, I guess, a basic requirement of establishing a secure communication channel between the devices that they're going to interact. So there are different ways in which one could do that. Typically, one would use public encryption to do that. There are other possibilities, but just bear with me. I'm going to go through one possibility that uses the Diffie-Hellman protocol, which my guess would probably be very familiar to you, but we're not going to spend too much time on it, so just bear with me for a second, and then we'll see why the existing techniques are not sufficient. And I'll then describe an approach that we've taken to augment the existing techniques. So in this case, we're assuming that there are two principals, Alice and Bob, that want to talk to each other. They have private keys, in this case A and B, and they have to somehow agree on a shared encryption key that will be used to secure their communications. So this is a watered-down version of Diffie-Hellman. Let's assume that A takes the initiative and starts the communication. What A has to do is come up with a random value J, and then A produces the equivalent of a public key by elevating G to the power of A and sending that to Bob. Now, with those two, Bob can actually calculate the encryption key, we'll call that K, by taking G to the power of A and elevating it by the power of B, his private key, so that Alice can also obtain the same key. What she will have to do is, well, send, in this case, G to the power of B, which is Bob's private key, and Alison can also calculate K. So if everything went out right, K will be the same with both Alice and Bob. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that in a wireless environment, it's actually quite hard to figure out who your device is actually talking to. And there are two specific attacks on the scheme that I just described. One of them is basically a spoofing attack. When Alice tries to communicate with Bob, we can assume that there is a malicious third party, we'll call it X, and when A starts to communicate with B, well, what X could do is that it could basically take B off the air by transmitting, assume X personality, in effect, spoof Bob's identity after jamming Bob. And from then on, basically, the communication happens between Alice and the attacker who is impersonating Bob. Another possibility, actually more likely, is that we will have a man-in-the-middle attack, where Alice and Bob are still both working, but we have a third party that will actually authenticate with both, and we'll be able to see all the communication as it's going from A to B without either of them knowing. In this particular case, what happens is that in reality, Alice authenticates with the attacker X, and Bob does the same. And at the end of the day, they each end up with an encryption key, but as it turns out, the encryption key is not the same for Alice and Bob. Now, the attacker knows both, so that any content that is sent by Alice to Bob, basically, it decrypts it and then encrypts it with the other key, so it goes completely undetected. So how are we going to fix this problem? Well, fixing this problem in the general cases is not easy. But for the particular applications that we have in mind, where you're actually interacting with devices that are nearby, well, we think that we can actually take advantage of the fact that interaction is with devices that are co-located. And we can take advantage of that co-location to find a good answer to this problem. Now, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be assuming that the devices that we're trying to pair are actually closer between them than the attacker. Okay, the attacker is going to be a little bit farther away than the devices that we're trying to group. Yes, please.
Why does that matter? I mean, can't the attacker just use a high-strength signal from a distance?
The question is, why does it matter, and whether the attacker can use a high, I guess, a high-power signal. That's exactly what I'm assuming. I'm assuming that you have an attacker that may be actually kilometers away, and they have a very powerful antenna, and they're trying to basically convince us that they are next to us and that we should actually talk to them. But my assumption is that actually, in reality, the device with, let's say I'm trying to pair with you, and the attacker will actually, if there are 2 meters separating us, well, the distance separating us from the attacker will be greater than 2 meters. So the attacker is actually not in between the two of us. That's the one assumption that I make. All right. So this is not a new problem, and some people have proposed different solutions to it. I guess the simplest solution is just to at least forget of the wireless part of it when it comes to authenticating, and actually carrying a cable around so that you use to actually set up a channel, you agree on a key, and from then on you actually use wireless. This is highly impractical, because my guess is nobody's going to be carrying cables around. A more practical, somehow, alternative is to try to use short-range communication to set up the secure channel. And probably the most common alternative here is basically Bluetooth, which is supposed to have a 10-meter range. Similar approaches have been proposed with other technologies, such as infrared, ultrasound, and near-field communication is getting a lot of attention out of lately. Now, the problem with that is that, as a member of the audience mentioned, there could be an attacker that has a very powerful antenna and is actually located very far away, but nevertheless can actually eavesdrop on our communication and can actually inject traffic. So you may be asking yourself, about this image over here. That, as it turns out, is a nice device called the Blue Sniper Rifle, developed by the Flexis group. And what it is, it's although it looks like a rifle, it's really not a rifle. It's a Bluetooth device that has attached a really powerful directional antenna. And what this little thing lets this guy do is basically pair with Bluetooth devices up to a mile away. Okay, so with this kind of equipment, you can actually extend the Bluetooth range by 2 orders of magnitude, which means that communication technology that you may perceive as short range, if you have the right hardware, can actually be attacked from very, very far away. Now, another alternative is to actively involve the user. Such that after let's say, a Diffie-Hellman exchange, the user, if the 2 devices have a screen, looks at the screen and makes sure that the 2 keys are actually identical, and thus there is no man-in-the-middle attack. That in itself is not very practical, because mobile devices tend to have small screens, and users tend to say yes to anything. So doesn't really work very well, and it's taxing on the user. So what is that I'm going to propose? I'm going to propose a completely different approach to it. What we're going to do is we're going to pair devices by deriving a secret, but the secret is going to be derived from the radio environment itself. Okay, not by transmitting, but actually by listening to the radio environment. So what this is doing is basically recognizing, well, if the devices are actually close by, they should be perceiving a similar environment. If, let's say, the two devices can sense this environment, well, hopefully, we can find something that we can build a secret, a joint secret, based on that, and we can then secure a communication based on that secret. Yes?
So this man in the middle of attack is the problem of the symmetric key, right? It's more stronger authentication or encryption will have this man in the middle.
No. Unfortunately, this is not, first of all, I'm not assuming symmetric cryptography. I'm assuming public key cryptography. There was I guess I should repeat the question. There was a question about whether the man in the middle attack is an issue of symmetric key cryptography. It's not. Even when you have public key cryptography, the problem that we're trying to solve is, well, when I get a public key from someone, how can I be sure that that is, let's say you have a phone, Mahesh has a phone, and I have a phone. I want to pair with Mahesh, and basically I get a public key that tells me that this is Mahesh's phone, and this is the public key for it. How can I be sure that, in fact, Mahesh was the one that sent me that key, and it wasn't someone else spoofing the device? Excuse me? Oh, yes. So there is no, that's right. Yes, because the assumption is that these two devices are unknown to each other. They're just meeting, and they're trying to communicate, and there is no other side channel. Yeah. All right. So what we're going to do is, in effect, we're going to use implicitly the fact that we're communicating on the same environment, and that if we perceive some commonality in it, we're going to use that as the source of a secret, and we're going to listen on the environment and basically on ambient radio sources to try to derive that secret. And in effect, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that if you know the environment, and you can prove to me that the radio environment looks so and so, that will be good enough to show that you're actually physically present there. Well, what are the advantages to this approach? First of all, it doesn't require any extra hardware. It basically just uses the radio that's already available on the device itself. It doesn't require user involvement to verify that the authentication was carried out properly. And finally, it's not subject to eavesdropping, because you're actually not transmitting. You are just listening. Okay? Other sources are transmitting, and out of that, we are composing a secret. Oops. All right. So there are certain requirements for this to actually work, or rather assumptions. One of the assumptions has to do with, actually all of the assumptions have to do with the environment that we're listening to. One assumption has to do with the nature of the specific place where the pairing is taking place. And the assumption is that there is temporal variability. Okay? We are assuming that the radio environment on a given location actually changes over short periods of time. If that was not the case, then it would be basically trivial to determine how the environment looks at that particular location. So what we're seeing here is signal strength from 3 radio sources. Time is going in this direction. This is signal strength. And as you can see, over time, the signal strength that I perceive these radio sources to be transmitting at goes up and down. And it's actually quite hard to predict how variations will the variations. 2, there has to be spatial variability in the sense that if the signal strength of different places of the same environment should be independent in some sense, or very hard to correlate. Why is this important? Well, because if the 2 devices are located in one part of the environment and an attacker is, let's say, a few meters away, and they perceive exactly the same environment as the friendly devices being paired, well, the attacker will be able to fool them. On the other hand, what we see is that, in fact, the radio environment changes quite drastically, even as we move very small amounts of distances. So what we're seeing here is, again, receiver signal strength for 3 Wi-Fi access points, and some pretty much moving. I mean, this is basically a student moving through the lab distances on the x-axis. And what you can see is that the signal strength moves up and down drastically. And it's not a pattern that is easy to predict either. Yes?
Were those signals all recorded simultaneously, or was it by moving across? I mean,
Oh, they were.
If they were recorded at the same time, then you have the problem of the variability from the first assumption could be what's showing up.
Oh, so they were recorded simultaneously, but what you are seeing here is that the variability, I guess while I'm fixed on a place, I'm sorry, I should repeat the question. There was a question about whether variability was because there is actually variability even in the same spot, or whether the variability is because I guess the recorder is moving. What we see is that if you stay put in a given location, the variability is typically up and down by 5 dBs. So look at the scales. The variability here is much higher than 5 dBs. So this is not because basically one location, it's because we're moving around. And all right. And finally.
So what is the source of the variability there, actually?
Oh, multipath. So it's a multipath effect. So all these measurements are taken indoors. Actually, even you do see these things even outdoors. What happens is that there are different objects on which the signal bounces. The receiver actually receives multiple copies of the same signal. And even if I move a few centimeters in any direction, the phase at which those copies converge changes. And that determines whether they add up together or they subtract. And that's why we see these huge differences in signal strength. Okay? In this particular case, we are measuring Wi-Fi signals. For Wi-Fi, it's enough to move about between 10 and 20 centimeters to see significant differences in signal strength. Yes?
The probability may be low, but is it possible, for example, if I'm in the middle, but my 2 neighbors countable meters away, but they still receive the same signal. They are apart from each other, but they still receive the signal strength at the 2 nodes still the same.
The question is, if you're in the middle of 2 neighbors, whether the 2 neighbors will see similar signal strengths. It depends. And actually, I'm going to show you the results of some experiments that shine some light into that. All right. The final requirement is that, well, the environment that the 2 devices that we're trying to pair should see should be similar, and the environment that an attacker that is farther away observes should be different. So what we're seeing here is the result of a very simple experiment carried out with 3 laptops. Okay, we have 2 laptops that are 2 centimeters away, and then another laptop that's about 10 meters away. Now, what you're seeing here, on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is receiver signal strength, and every dot here is a packet. Now, so here we're basically showing the 2 devices that are 5 centimeters away, and basically this is showing one of the devices that appears on this graph plus the one that is 10 meters away. Now, when there is a line between them, or any symbol other than an X, that means that the 2 devices captured the same packet. Okay? They received the same packet, and the packet was not corrupted. Okay? And 2, we see the difference in signal strength at which they received it. So the point to consider is that the 2 devices that are 5 centimeters away, first of all, do effectively capture a much higher proportion of the packets than the devices that are separated by about 10 meters. And as you can see, the differences in signal strength here are much smaller than the differences in signal strength over there. So what we conclude is that the devices that are close by see not an identical radio environment. We were not expecting that, but it's a much more similar radio environment than the devices that are farther away. Yes?
Were these signals observed by the same brand of radio transceiver?
Yes, they were.
What if there are different radio transceivers?
We're going to talk about that as well. Hold on that question. There's a question about whether the devices that we're using all the same network card and the same antenna, in fact. In this particular experiment, yes, they are. We have, however, experimented with different antennas. And obviously, the different antennas do perceive differences in signal strength. But what we've seen is that one can actually develop normalization functions that let you roughly bring them on all to roughly the same level so that you can actually compare them. All right. So this is nice, but how you actually apply it in practice? We think that there are at least two ways in which one can actually use this information about the radio environment to do authentication. One approach is to take existing public cryptography methods, such as Diffie-Hellman, and augment them with proximity-based authentication by developing a token, one-time use-only token, that ensures that the public key that you got was actually given to you by somebody that is really near you. Another approach is to forget about public cryptography altogether and to obtain an encryption key directly from the radio environment itself. Okay? If you do that, well, you don't need public cryptography. Whether you can do that in a more CPU-efficient way, it's something we yet don't know. So we haven't done much with this approach yet. It's in our future work. We have, however, done significant work on developing an authentication token. And we've developed a prototype we call Amigo, which takes a Diffie-Hellman exchange and adds a proximity-based authentication token to it. And it works more or less as following. First, you go through the regular Diffie-Hellman exchange. And once you're done with it, what you do is you then check whether there was a man-in-the-middle attack, or whether the person with whom you authenticated is actually located next to you or close to you. And so the way it works is we monitor the radio environment. We obtain a token. We distill a token out of monitoring the radio environment, and then we exchange a signature of our observation. The two devices get to compare the signature they got from the other device with their own observation, and based on that, they determine whether the other device is nearby or not. It works in the following way. After you are done with the Diffie-Hellman exchange, the two devices start listening to the radio environment, and they produce what we call a signature, basically signatures of the packets. What the signature is a set of packets that you captured plus the signal strength. In this particular case, we don't send the packets themselves. Instead, what we send is a hash of the packet plus its our RSI. Well, once a device gets a signature from the other device, what it will do is first it actually has to align them, because the two devices might have started sensing the environment at slightly different times. So we basically look for the first packet that we have in common. Once we are done with aligning, we actually break the signature into smaller pieces, because we want to be able to analyze. It's actually hard to analyze the whole signature at once, so we analyze smaller parts of it. We break that into pieces we call instances. We feed the set of instances through a classifier, and I'm going to describe how the classifier works in a minute. And the classifier tells us whether, based on comparing these two signatures, we are collocated, or the device that we're trying to attach to is actually far away. All right. So then the input to the classifier is a bunch of instances, which is basically hashes of packets plus signal strength. And the classifier itself has two stages. It's a two-stage boosted binary stump classifier. The first stage basically filters out noisy data, and it looks at the proportion of packets that we have in common. And if there are too few packets in common, it basically marks that particular instance as invalid, and we don't take it into account anymore. And in practice, what we've seen is that if you set a threshold of 75%, it works pretty well. Well, for those packets that were not marked invalid, we then look at how different the instance that we got from the other device is from the one that we captured locally. And we basically scored the instance similarity. And that score is based on how close the signal strengths are, as well as how correlated the changes in signal strength are. Okay? So if the two devices see that a given radio source goes up and down together, well, in all likelihood, they're nearby. Once we have that score, we assign what we call a margin to each of this. Basically, a marginal score is the same to each of the instances. And once we have, we then, go from a numerical score to a Boolean one. If the score is higher than threshold, we say that that's a vote, a positive vote for collocation. If it's lower, it's a negative vote for collocation. And what we do is we then tally the votes, and it's basically a majority vote. So if most of the instances are confident that you're close by, we determine that you're close by. Otherwise, we say you're not. All right, before I can actually show you experimental results, there is one more issue that we have to tackle. And that is the possibility of a man-in-the-middle attack attacking the authentication process itself. Okay, because I could have the devices figure out the signatures, and then they send the signature to the man-in-the-middle that basically just relays it between them and fools the whole system. So to prevent against that, we've developed a commitment protocol that exposes the man-in-the-middle by forcing them to reveal themselves by creating phony data. It works more or less as follows. We take the signature, we break it into n blocks. We then generate a nonce, and we send each of the blocks in order. But we don't just send them like that. We take a block, and we append to the block a hash of the session key. This is the Diffie-Hellman session key, a hash of the node ID, and then the block itself. And then we take that whole thing, and we encrypt it with the nonce. Okay? So in step one, each of these two devices actually has to produce the first block. And they won't send the second block until they've received the first block from the other guy. So let's see what will happen. If, after Diffie-Hellman, turns out that we have a man-in-the-middle attack, well, in the first stage, this device will send this packet over here. Again, it's encrypted with the nonce that A created. And the problem that X has is that, well, it has to give B a packet. But it can't decrypt this one over here because it doesn't know the nonce. The nonce is only sent at the end of the protocol after we've gone through all the steps. Okay? So what are X's alternatives? Well, it could just take the packet as it is and forward it to Bob. But then Bob will detect that there is a man-in-the-middle attack, because once it gets all the different, packets, blocks, and the nonce is made public, well, he will be able to decrypt this thing and see that the session key is K1. But Bob knows that the session key is actually K2, so they don't match. So it knows that something funky went through is happening there. The hash of the identity is done so that basically X doesn't mirror back a packet and just relays it back to Bob. So just sending the packet is not viable. The other alternative that X has is basically to construct a packet that looks more or less like that by guessing what the signature looks like. And as I'm going to show you in a minute, that is actually not feasible. So in effect, X has to create random data and hope that it sticks. Yes? The signature is, it's right now it's made of two things. It's a hash of the packet and its signal strength.
Okay, as long as I can guess correctly, like the signals RSI, I can.
If you can guess roughly what are the packets that are received by the other guy and at what signal strength, you can fool the system.
Yeah, I guess the packets I can hear over here, right?
No, that's the interesting part. OK, so I'm going to show you the results from a set of experiments where we progressively look at more sophisticated attackers. Okay, so for the base case, I'm considering a scenario where we have two devices that I'm trying to pair. The devices are 5 centimeters away from each other. And there are 4 attackers that are located at progressively larger distances. So there is an attacker that is 1 meter away, another that's 3, 5, and 10 meters away. Okay? And they're all monitoring the same radio environment at the same time. For simplicity, they're all using the same Wi-Fi cards. I'll talk about other experiments that use different cards at the end of the talk. Yes?
Where's the source of the packets that you're receiving?
The question is, where is the source of the packets? The answer is we don't know. We are listening at ambient sources. So any device that has a Wi-Fi card to it and it's transmitting, that's a source. And in fact, we actually find quite a few of those sources. So in fact, if these guys were to be transmitting, we would also listen to their sources as well. All right. Anyway, another two, parts of the aspects of the experiment is that all devices are actually at the same height and there is line of sight. This actually turns out to be the best possible case for the attacker. As you will see, if there is no line of sight, then it's actually harder for the attacker. All right. So the devices are monitoring the environment at the same time. We use this setting to collect 2 traces. One trace we use for actually training our classifier. And the other trace we're actually going to use for testing it. So the results I'm going to show you are from the second trace we collected. We collected it actually 2 months later and in a different place of our lab just to make sure that there was no location-specific abnormality that would result in, would give us erroneous results. To give you an idea of how big the traces are, in about 10 minutes, each of the devices was able to detect between 30 and 50,000 packets. We detected about 11 access points, but the traces themselves have many more Wi-Fi sources because, well, these are just the access points, but we actually have clients that are using that, those access points. And for our purposes, it really doesn't make a difference. If, as long as you're transmitting, we can actually use that. All right. So let's look at results. And I'm presenting results in terms of false positives and false negatives. So first, let's look at the false negatives. False negative is basically a scenario where 2 devices that are actually co-located failed to authenticate. Okay? And what we see here is that that actually doesn't happen. If we wait for, this is time going this way, if you wait for as little as 5 seconds, the rate of false positives basically drops to 0. Okay? So if you're close by, we'll be able to authenticate you. Now, if we look at the false positive rate, which is actually much more important, this is the rate at which we say that a device that's actually not co-located, it basically manages to fool us, and we conclude they are actually co-located. And in this case, we are looking at, well, where the attackers are. So we have an attacker at 1, 5, 1, 3, 5, and 10 meters. And what we can see is that for 3, 5, and 10 meters, if you wait for 5 seconds, we can very reliably identify the attackers as attackers, and we don't pair with them. On the other hand, the guy that's located just 1 meter away evidently perceives an environment that is close enough to the devices that are just 5 centimeters away, so that actually fools us, and we conclude that it's actually co-located. All right. So how can we improve this? We look at 2 ways of adding some local entropy, making the signal change or make it more different, for the, co-located devices than the attacker. Just to give you a point of reference, the line of sight case is the results I just described, where we're looking at the case of the attacker that is just 1 meter away. If the attacker is farther than that, we can reliably, detect them. So we're only interested in that attacker. And if we wait for 5 seconds, in 80% of cases, that attacker will be able to fool us. So we look at the case where we have 2 devices that are 5 centimeters away. We have drywall, about 3 or 4 inches of drywall at the typical width of a cubicle wall. And then we have an attacker that's actually just sitting next to the drywall. So in fact, it's, let's say, 3, 4 inches away, but there is drywall in the middle. And what we see is that drywall really doesn't affect signal strength, and this is not surprising. And this attacker even does better. Now, if we use a different technique, and I call this the student in the middle technique, where we have the two devices 5 centimeters away, we put a student in the middle, and then basically an attacker 1 meter away, we see that the rate at which the attacker can fool us actually drops very significantly. And the reason for that is that, well, human beings are basically bags of water. We absorb a lot of radio signals, and because of that, the environment that the two devices, the collocated devices, see differs quite a bit. On the other hand, if you put concrete wall, then basically, even if it's just 30 centimeters of concrete, the environment is so different that basically an attacker cannot fool you. All right. Another even simpler approach to create local entropy is for devices that are the devices that are trying to pair. Well, if those were to move, or something in their closed environment were to move, that will actually affect the radio environment. And in this particular case, what we're doing is we're looking at basically putting our hand on top of the antenna and moving it. I mean, moving our hand on top of the antenna. And what we see is that that generates a lot of local entropy, and within 5 seconds, we are able to identify the attacker. So we're happy to conclude that hand waving helps, if you didn't know already. All right.
But was that hand moved on one of the antennas?
Well, the two devices are fairly close to each other, so we sort of moved our hand, next, I mean, on top of the two antennas. All right. OK, so we also look at a slight variation of this scenario, where in this case we're saying, well, maybe the devices that you're trying to attach are not located 5 centimeters away. I mean, there are many, many cases when I want to basically pair with a device that's slightly farther away. So in this case, we look at a scenario where the two friendly devices are 1 meter away. And again, we have an attacker that is roughly 2 meters away from this device and 10 meters away from that device. We're asking whether we can actually detect that. And the answer is yes. If you wait for as long as little as 5 seconds, you can actually detect attackers, as well as you successively succeed in pairing. All right, let's look at more sophisticated attackers, because right now, I mean, so far attackers have been actually quite dumb. So what a slightly smarter attacker could do is to actually survey the environment ahead of hand. If you know that the pairing is going to take place in a specific location, well, what you do is you show up at that location early, and you basically figure out what radio sources you can hear and at what signal strengths, and you build a distribution of those signal strengths, because as we saw, it changes over time. And then when the two devices actually show up and try to pair, and again, we're assuming that they actually show up in exactly the place where you were expecting them, which may not be that crazy. If, let's say, one of the devices is an ATA machine, and then we have a user coming next to it. There are cases where we could there's an expectation that the pairing will happen in a specific place. So let's see what happens. So when the pairing actually occurs, as the device that is farther away hears packets, well, there are basically two possibilities. When packets are from a source that it knew, because it basically detected it when it surveyed the environment, so what it does, it basically replaces the RRSI, the one that it hears, from the distribution. Now, for packets that come from an unknown source, because somebody else moved in and started to transmit, or for whatever reason, a source that wasn't transmitting at the time of the survey, the attacker has to basically choose one of two options. He can discard that packet, or he can basically leave the RSSI unchanged, or he can guess. And what we've seen is that actually just leaving it unchanged is the best for the attacker. So in this case, we're simulating an attack that, I mean, we already know that actually the attacker that is just 1 meter away, and we're not using hand waving here. So an attacker that's 1 meter away can reliably communicate. So in this case, we're basically saying, well, can an attacker that is 3, 5, and 10 meters away, if they know the distribution of RSSI, can they monitor the environment from, let's say, 5 meters away And will they get enough information? Will that be enough to authenticate? And what we see is that for 10 and 5 meters away, 3 and 10 meters away, that's actually not the case. It's sort of a fluke that it's kind of weird that 5 meters away sees better results than 3 meters away, but I guess that's has to do with the multipath environment that we actually tested this in. But what we see is that in the general case, even if you're just a few meters away, the environment is significantly different enough that you actually see different packets. Okay, this has actually been reported before by other groups as well. But in any case, we see that in about 20% of the cases, this particular attacker that's 5 meters away will be able to fool us. Well, if you use hand waving in this particular case, again, it drops down to 0 in less than 5 seconds. We then look at the case where we have an extremely powerful attacker. This is actually really not a feasible attack. It's an attack where the attacker has control of every single radio source in the environment. Okay? All transmissions are controlled by the attacker. Not just that, but the attacker knows for sure which packets are actually heard by the victims and which aren't. More so, the attacker has the actual distribution of RSI as heard by the victim. Okay? So in reality, this is an oracle. Okay? So if we know exactly what packets they hear and what signal strength, well, for sure we can fool them. I'm not showing the result of that approach without hand waving, because obviously we're able to fool them 100% of the time. We know what packets, we know what signal strength. What's interesting is that even for this attack, which is really highly infeasible in practice, something as simple as moving your hand in front of the antenna defeats the attack very, very quickly. So after 30 seconds or 40 seconds, basically, this attack just fails. Yes?
So does how good your hand waving works as a guard? How much does that decrease as the signal gets stronger? Or is it independent of signals? Because my concern is more an attacker who jams the entire environment with a very strong signal so that their one signal from a known source is the only signal that it thinks going to pick up.
Right. I guess the short answer is we don't know yet. But my guess is actually that the precise opposite is likely to happen. The higher the signal strength, the more changes in the environment have a more significant effect on it. Very low power signals tend to suffer much less for changes in the multipath than very high power signals. But that's just speculation. All right. So hopefully, in conclusions, I've shown you that it's actually possible to use knowledge of the radio environment to prove physical proximity. There are several advantages to this approach. First of all, you don't need extra hardware. You can just use the existing radio on your device, as long as the radio actually lets you supports promiscuous mode. Something like Bluetooth, for instance, won't work, but 82.11 does work nicely. It doesn't require user involvement as far as verifying the pairing. As we said, for certain kind of attacks, if you want to make sure that certain attackers fail, you have to do a little bit of hand waving. So that obviously is user involvement. And as we mentioned, it's not subject to eavesdropping, just because you're not transmitting. So even if the attacker has very sensitive antennas, they really can't do much with them. And I describe very briefly, I guess, two potential methods for implementing this technique. One by augmenting traditional public cryptography with a proximity-based token. And we just, I guess, theorized that you can actually derive an encryption key straight from the environment. There is tons of future work. This project has been going on for actually less than a year. So if anything, we think that we've just sort of scratched the surface. We think, well, first of all, we obviously have to deal with system robustness. one key aspect is, well, dealing with different cards and different antennas. So far, we've only run some very preliminary experiments where we looked at different antennas. And what we've seen is that you can actually typically develop some kind of normalization functions. So if you think of the signature that gets exchanged, you basically use a portion of the signature to figure out correspondence between the signal strength levels that the different antennas are getting. And there is typically there is a linear correspondence there. And once you know that, well, basically you normalize the rest of the signature. And our preliminary experiments show that it works. We need to characterize the technique in other environments. Our environment is actually quite bursty. We have 11 access points, and, well, it's basically a computer science lab. Everyone has a laptop, and they're transmitting all the time. One wonders how well this technique will work when there is just one lone access point that is just sending beacons, for instance. We don't know. We think that there is a lot of room for improvement. We plan to look at software radios. So far, everything I've described so far is using off-the-shelf hardware that gives us access to RSSI information at the packet level. We really don't have finer granularity than that. We would like to. So we plan to look at using software radios to actually get access to physical layer information that we think will let us achieve higher granularity, lower granularity, I guess, so that you don't even have to hand wave at all. Other techniques that we would like to explore is, well, why just focus on one radio? You can potentially assume that the device has multiple radios around it. You could potentially sense with, multiple radios simultaneously, and hopefully that would increase your accuracy as well. And obviously, we would like to develop a technique that derives an actual encryption key from the environment itself so that we can remove the requirement for public key encryption. All right. The stuff that most of the stuff I described here appears on, is on a paper that is soon to appear on UbiComp in September. That's, I guess, the information. And the paper is not yet available on my website, but actually, if you go to my students' website, my guess is you'll be able to find it there. I should have said this from the beginning, and I'm sorry I didn't, but this work is actually in collaboration with a lot of really talented people. Alex Rashchavsky is a PhD student of mine. He will be hitting the job market this coming season. Other people involved are Adding Scannell, also a student of mine, and Anthony Lamarca from Intel Research in their Seattle lab. And it's been a pleasure, so I'll take questions. Yes?
So I think this is very interesting. I think that one of the keys is going to be getting it so that the attacker has to be closer than a meter. Because a meter seems, it seems like a meter, while it sounds like, well, that's a pretty close attacker. If it's an attacker standing there, sure. But if you were authenticating to a computer in the podium, it means I can have a device in the podium that did a man in the middle or something like that.
So I guess
putting a device that's dedicated to being the attacker and nearby seems easy in a lot of cases. Like the ATM, I can put it in the envelope drawer and just pick it up a couple hours later and stick it in the drawer.
Sure. So there is a question about trying to get accuracy that goes significantly below a meter, because you could have, I guess, a dedicated attacker that just puts an antenna that's really, really close. Sure. But even, the problem with that, I guess the answer is what kinds of applications. Yes, I think there are applications that need to be much better than a meter. I think that there are some applications that are probably more than enough. That a meter is probably more than enough. To give you just actually a very simple example, whenever you check into a hotel, you're typically using their Wi-Fi. How do you know that you're actually using the Wi-Fi hotel as opposed to somebody that has a van outside and basically has a phishing Wi-Fi, which is a problem in general. In that case, in most cases, the attacker is actually much farther away than a meter. So even a meter resolution or even a 10 meters resolution for some applications is more than enough. We obviously want to achieve finer resolution than a meter, but for some kinds of attacks, it really doesn't matter how fine the resolution is, it still won't work. So for the case of, well, I have an antenna that's really between the two devices, well, again, if it's an ATM that I'm trying to authenticate with, I can basically have an antenna that's really on top of the ATM itself. So it doesn't really matter how close you're trying to get to the ATM, you're actually just laying yourself on top of the ATM. So there are certain attacks for which this will not work. But we think that there are some applications for which it will. Yes?
I guess another way to rephrase that question is, what is the limiting factor which is giving, what is the component in your system which is giving the accuracy? Is it the classifier? Because from the graphs of signal strength and kind of as a function of time or as a function of distance, it seems to have much finer than meter resolution.
Yeah, so there is a question about what is that is, where is that meter of granularity coming from? Is it the classifier? And I think the answer to that is yes, it's partly the classifier. We think that if we spend more time looking at features, we can probably come up with a better classifier. So I think that will definitely help. A part of it is also having to do with the fact that the signal strength that we're getting is actually an average over the whole packet. We really don't have any control over what the card decides to tell us. Basically, we're not, we don't have access to the card's firmware at this stage, and the card only reports signal strength and the granularity of a packet. That's why we're interested actually in looking at software radios, because we think that if we can go below the granularity of a packet, hopefully we can do better. Now, the other problem with using off-the-shelf cards, using off-the-shelf cards, it's great because potentially it could, you could actually implement it on real hardware. But the other problem with it is that typically the card gives you access to packets that were actually captured. It doesn't give you access to just noise. So we think that if you have a software radio, you can actually just look at the noise itself. You don't even have to look at well-formed packets that are captured. So we hope that will give us finer granularity. But again, these are all speculations at this point. All right. Well, thank you very much.